I never imagined that one day, in the place I had always called home, surrounded by the familiar warmth of my own living room, I would feel a weight so heavy it pressed against my chest, making every breath a reminder of betrayal. A betrayal so intimate and painful that it came from the person I had loved more than anyone else in the world, the very person whose laughter had once filled these walls and whose presence had been my greatest comfort, my daughter Emily. My name is Jonathan Hayes, and for more than 52 years, I had lived by a principle so simple it had guided me through every hardship, every triumph, and every quiet moment of reflection. Family comes first, above all else. I had believed that as long as I gave love, support, and unwavering care, that love would inevitably return to me, not as obligation or routine, but as genuine connection, as loyalty, as the bond that keeps a family strong even when the world outside feels harsh and unforgiving. But life has a way of revealing truths in the cruelest of ways, often when we least expect it, often when our guard is down, often when we have shown nothing but kindness and vulnerability. And it was on one ordinary Tuesday morning, the kind of morning that feels like any other, with sunlight streaming lazily through the curtains and the quiet hum of the neighborhood drifting in through the slightly open window, that the world I had so carefully built began to unravel before my eyes. I received a diagnosis: chronic, persistent, manageable, but inescapable. A condition that would slow my body, drain my energy, and force me to reconsider the way I lived, the choices I had made, and the relationships I had taken for granted. And yet, it was not the diagnosis itself that left me breathless, nor the uncertainty of the future, but the way Emily reacted to it. The way the little girl I had cradled in my arms when she was frightened, the child whose scraped knees I had kissed and whose tears I had wiped away countless times, suddenly seemed to view me not as a father, not as someone worthy of love, but as a resource to be used, a weakness to be exploited, a vulnerability to be manipulated for her own advantage. At first, the changes were subtle, almost imperceptible. A sigh here, a concerned glance there, a small comment about how I needed to be careful, how I shouldn't attempt tasks alone, how she was worried I might overexert myself. I had brushed them off as natural concern, the instinctive response of a grown child witnessing a parent age, a response that comes from love and attachment. But slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the concern began to twist, bending into something darker, something calculated. She began to question my decisions in ways that weren't supportive but critical, almost condescending, as though every action I took now required her approval, her oversight, her sanction. She would hover at the edge of conversations, offer unsolicited advice with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and make statements designed to unsettle me, statements that framed my own natural limitations as failures or incompetence. She began to use my illness as a tool, a way to elicit guilt, to make me feel helpless, to manipulate me into doing what she wanted, and even more painfully, to justify her own selfish desires. I had spent my life instilling in her the values of honesty, compassion, and respect, believing that the love and guidance I offered would be reflected in her own actions. But it became painfully clear that she had learned only how to mask ambition with affection, how to cloak self-interest in the guise of concern. Every conversation became a minefield, every interaction a calculated move on a board I didn't realize I had been placed upon. She would say things like, "Dad, are you sure you can handle this? Maybe you should wait until I can help." Or, "I'm just worried about you. I don't want anything to happen." And though the words sounded caring, the underlying tone suggested impatience, judgment, and expectation, as though my natural state of vulnerability was a personal failure and her oversight was a deserved obligation. The house, once my sanctuary, became a place of subtle tension, where every choice I made, from picking up a tool to making a phone call, seemed to be scrutinized, evaluated, judged, and critiqued under the thin veil of love. It was exhausting, more exhausting than any physical ailment could ever be, to live constantly under the weight of manipulated concern, to feel that my own daughter was watching me not with the eyes of affection, but with the calculating eyes of someone waiting for me to falter. And yet, amid the anger, the confusion, and the mounting despair, a small but undeniable spark of clarity began to emerge. I realized that nothing I could do in haste would restore balance. Confrontation might provoke defensiveness, arguments, and distance. Shouting might only deepen the fracture between us. Tears might only give her more tools to wield against me. No, what I needed was patience, observation, and strategy. I needed to let time become my ally, to quietly regain my own sense of agency, to reclaim the dignity that had been chipped away by her subtle but relentless manipulations. And so, I began to craft a silent plan, a plan not born of revenge or malice, but of necessity and justice, a plan that relied on careful observation, subtle assertion, and measured action, allowing her to gradually see the reflection of her own behavior without confrontation, allowing her to recognize the truth of her actions in a way that could lead not to shame, but to understanding and correction. Each day, I reminded myself that time was a tool, that patience was a weapon more powerful than anger, and that by allowing the natural unfolding of events, I could regain control, not through force, but through clarity, foresight, and quiet persistence. And so, in that living room where the betrayal had first taken root, surrounded by the memories of laughter and love, I began to reclaim my own power, piece by piece, decision by decision, with a determination that was calm but resolute, knowing that the journey ahead would be long, that it would require careful navigation, and that the restoration of trust, the establishment of boundaries, and the gentle yet firm redirection of my daughter's behavior would not be immediate, but would, with time, yield a sense of justice that was earned and respected. It was in that moment, sitting on the edge of the familiar couch, the sunlight catching the slight gray in my hair, the weight of years pressing upon me, that I truly understood the quiet power of time, the subtle yet unyielding force that patience can become when wielded with intention, the truth that love and respect, once compromised, cannot be demanded but must be restored with care, and that even the deepest betrayal, even the most intimate wound, can become a catalyst for growth, for understanding, and for a stronger, more resilient connection if approached with wisdom, restraint, and the unwavering belief that time, when honored and harnessed, can be the greatest ally in reclaiming not only control over our lives, but the integrity and dignity that betrayal seeks to erode. And so I began, not with rage, not with despair, but with deliberate calm, my heart heavy yet resolute, my mind sharp yet patient, knowing that the path ahead would be long and uncertain, but also knowing that by letting time guide me, by letting observation illuminate the truth, and by letting careful, deliberate action replace impulsive reaction, I could navigate this betrayal, protect myself, and, perhaps most importantly, guide my daughter toward the understanding and respect that had always been the foundation of our family, revealing to both of us that even in the shadow of betrayal, patience and time are forces capable of restoring balance, dignity, and, ultimately, love. For decades, I had carried the quiet pride of a man who had lived his life with integrity, dedication, and unwavering commitment to the people he loved, believing that hard work, honesty, and love were the pillars on which a stable, happy family could be built, and that as long as I maintained these principles, life would offer a sense of balance and reciprocal care that made every struggle worth enduring. And yet, as I approached my 52nd year, I began to notice subtle, unsettling shifts in the one person whose approval and affection had always been my greatest source of pride and comfort, my daughter Emily, whose childhood had been filled with laughter, curiosity, and that bright-eyed innocence that makes a parent feel invincible, as though no harm could ever touch the bubble of love we had carefully nurtured over the years. Emily, who had once clung to me in fear, whose scraped knees I had cleaned with careful hands, whose tears I had wiped away with soft cloths and whispered reassurances, who had once decorated my world with joy and admiration, began to change in ways so subtle, so almost imperceptible at first, that I doubted my own perception, chalking up her increasingly critical comments to the natural friction of a young adult finding her independence, to the stress of schooling and social pressures, or to the normal growing pains that every parent expects their children to go through. But as days and weeks passed, I could no longer dismiss the pattern, as it became increasingly clear that her observations and questions were not born of concern or love but carried a sharpened edge, a calculated tone that made me question my own judgment and left me feeling smaller, weaker, and increasingly unsure of myself, as though the ground beneath me had shifted without warning and I was navigating a home that suddenly felt unfamiliar and fraught with invisible traps. It started with the questioning of simple things: how I spent my money, the decisions I made about our household, even the way I walked through rooms, as though my very movements required scrutiny, approval, or correction. And though I tried to rationalize it, convincing myself that it was simply Emily growing up and asserting her independence, my intuition, honed over decades of observing behavior and reading subtleties, began to tell me otherwise, that something more insidious was unfolding, that my own vulnerability, which had grown slightly with the gradual decline of my health, was being observed, measured, and weaponized in ways I had never anticipated. She would make casual comments that seemed caring on the surface. "Dad, maybe you shouldn't lift that. What if you hurt yourself?" Or, "Are you sure you're okay to go alone? I'm just worried." But the subtext was a sharpened reminder of my limitations, a veiled accusation that I was incapable, irresponsible, or negligent, and I could feel the weight of guilt pressing down on me each time, making me hesitate, second-guess, and even apologize for normal, everyday acts of living, acts that had once been second nature and unremarkable. Every favor I accepted, every small act of kindness I extended, every time I allowed her to assist me, was subtly twisted into evidence of my inadequacy, a proof point she could leverage to manipulate, guilt, or control me, turning our interactions into a minefield where one misstep, one wrong tone, one perceived flaw could explode into a storm of emotional consequence, leaving me anxious, defensive, and painfully aware of how much ground I had lost in the subtle warfare being waged within the walls of my own home. I began to see the patterns more clearly, the way she would linger at key moments, the strategic timing of comments, the way she framed her actions as concern while the undertone carried expectation and silent judgment. And I realized with a sinking feeling that this was not a fleeting phase of rebellion, not a normal assertion of growing independence, but something far more deliberate, something calculated, something I could not simply endure or dismiss, as it carried the unmistakable hallmark of betrayal cloaked in care, a betrayal that undermined the foundation of trust and respect I had worked tirelessly to build, and the realization was like a slow, steady ache that crept into my chest, that made familiar rooms feel alien, that left me questioning whether the family I had raised with devotion still existed as I had known it, or if it had quietly transformed into a terrain where my own daughter, the person I had protected and guided for more than 2 decades, had begun to wield my vulnerabilities as tools of control. And as this awareness sank deeper, I felt a quiet, simmering anger, not the explosive, rash anger of a man who lashes out, but a slow-burning, patient, watchful anger that studied, observed, and waited, a resolve that grew stronger with each calculated manipulation she attempted, a recognition that though I had been perceived as perfect, invincible, and all-knowing in her eyes, this perfection had made me blind to the subtle encroachments, and now that I saw them, I could begin to strategize, to reclaim my own dignity, and to navigate this delicate situation with the precision and care it demanded, understanding that the goal was not to punish or humiliate, but to regain equilibrium, to restore boundaries, and to allow both of us the opportunity to confront the truth of our actions, to reflect, and to rebuild a relationship founded not on coercion, manipulation, or guilt, but on mutual respect and honest affection. I reflected on the countless years of my life spent striving to provide for her, to shelter her from the harsh realities I had faced, to instill in her the values I held dear: integrity, compassion, patience, and fairness. And I realized with a mix of sorrow and clarity that despite my best intentions, those values were being tested in the harshest possible way, through the quiet erosion of trust by someone I had loved unconditionally. And the emotional weight of that realization was staggering, as it forced me to confront my own limitations, not just physically or financially, but emotionally and psychologically, recognizing that being a father does not inoculate one against betrayal, that love alone does not guarantee loyalty, and that sometimes the hardest lessons come from within the very walls we have sought to make safe. And yet, amidst the pain, I felt the stirring of resolve, a deep, unshakable understanding that patience, observation, and thoughtful action would be my greatest allies, that time itself could become a weapon, not one of harm or vengeance, but one of clarity, restoration, and justice, and that by allowing the natural course of events to unfold, by quietly asserting my presence, maintaining my integrity, and documenting the subtle manipulations that had shaken my sense of security, I could begin to reclaim the respect and balance that had been disrupted, not through confrontation or aggression, but through careful guidance, measured responses, and unwavering attention to the dynamics at play. And as I sat in the quiet of my home, the late afternoon sunlight casting long shadows across the floor, I could feel a mixture of sorrow, determination, and clarity settling over me. A profound understanding that the journey ahead would require patience, emotional intelligence, and unwavering resolve. That the path to restoring harmony and dignity would be long and challenging, but ultimately, that the quiet power of observation and time would allow me not only to navigate this betrayal but to emerge stronger, wiser, and more resilient, and to give Emily the chance to see herself, her actions, and their consequences in a way that could foster growth, understanding, and a renewed foundation of trust, so that what had begun as quiet manipulation and subtle betrayal could transform into a profound lesson in patience, respect, and the enduring strength of familial bonds, proving that even the most seemingly perfect father, turned vulnerable by age and circumstance, could reclaim his footing, restore balance, and guide the relationship toward a place of mutual understanding and genuine love, if he approached the challenge with wisdom, calm, and an unwavering belief in the quiet yet formidable power of time. It began with small, almost imperceptible actions, so subtle that I initially dismissed them as coincidence or the natural ebb and flow of daily life between a father and his grown daughter. But over time, these tiny acts revealed a pattern, a carefully orchestrated campaign of control that I had been blind to for far too long, and at first, it was the forgotten reminders, the casual slips, the moments when she accidentally failed to mention an appointment, a bill, or an important call, leaving me scrambling and anxious, only for her to swoop in with a tone of feigned concern that made me feel not just helpless, but guilty, as though my inability to manage simple tasks was a personal failure rather than the predictable consequence of age, illness, and human imperfection. And it was in those moments that I began to notice how she wielded my vulnerabilities as weapons, how she subtly insinuated herself into decisions I had always handled on my own, questioning my judgment with the sharpness of someone testing boundaries while maintaining a facade of care, asking pointed questions about finances, purchases, and minor household matters in a way that made me second-guess myself and feel inadequate, as though my role as a capable father and head of my own household had been quietly usurped, all under the guise of looking out for me. And at first, I wanted to believe it was unintentional, that perhaps she was simply trying to help. But the more I observed, the more I realized that this was not kindness. It was manipulation, a carefully constructed pattern designed to make me doubt my own abilities, to erode my confidence, and to subtly trap me within the parameters of her control without ever raising suspicion, so that every conversation became a delicate negotiation, every decision a potential battleground, and every smile or casual comment carried an undertone that suggested surveillance, judgment, and silent authority. And friends began to notice their comments thinly veiled with concern. "Jonathan, she's a bit harsh, isn't she?" And though I nodded politely and laughed it off, a part of me sank, realizing with a cold clarity that my home, the place I had built to be a sanctuary of warmth, laughter, and familial comfort, had quietly become a stage for subtle coercion and emotional ambush. And as the months passed, the manipulations became more overt, though still cloaked in care. The true betrayal revealing itself one evening as I rested on the familiar couch, weary from the day and allowing myself a rare moment of stillness, when she approached me with that familiar, disarming smile, soft and almost nurturing in tone, saying, "Dad, you really shouldn't handle that paperwork yourself. What if you mess it up and ruin everything?" And though the words seemed innocent, designed to protect me, I felt the unmistakable weight of something far darker in her gaze. The calculation, the precision, the deliberate shaping of circumstance to assert control rather than support. The glint of strategic advantage behind eyes that had once looked at me with unconditional love. And in that instant, a sharp, cold clarity struck me. This was not concern, not love, not even misguided care. This was deliberate manipulation. A subtle betrayal that sought to cage me, to render me dependent, to make me question my competence and erode the autonomy I had spent decades cultivating. And the realization was devastating, not because it was sudden, but because it had been building quietly, invisibly, for months, weaving itself into our daily interactions until I could no longer ignore it, until I understood that the very illness I had always tried to manage responsibly, the vulnerability I had born with dignity, had been weaponized against me, transformed into a tool that Emily wielded with calculated precision. And as the weight of that truth settled over me, I felt a mixture of anger, disbelief, and sorrow. The kind of sorrow that sinks deep into the bones. The kind of anger that does not shout or explode but simmers quietly, steadily, sharpening clarity and focus, because in that moment I understood that if I failed to respond, if I allowed her to continue unchecked, I would become a prisoner in my own home, ensnared in a dynamic designed to strip away my agency and diminish the man I had always been. And yet, alongside the despair, there emerged a sense of resolve, a recognition that this betrayal, as painful and destabilizing as it was, also presented a chance for deliberate, measured action, for patience and observation to become my allies, for time to work in my favor, allowing me to reclaim control, not through confrontation or rage, but through careful strategy, thoughtful assertion, and the quiet rebuilding of boundaries. And as I sat there, feeling the weight of her gaze, the calculated softness of her tone, and the chilling clarity of her intent, I made a silent vow to myself that I would not be subdued, that I would not let my own vulnerability be a weapon against me, that I would navigate this treacherous terrain with precision and patience, using every observation, every small interaction, and every calculated pause to turn the subtle betrayal into a catalyst for justice, understanding, and ultimately, a restoration of balance within our fractured relationship. And in that quiet, tense moment on the couch, I realized that the greatest battles often occur not in public, not with dramatic confrontation or visible conflict, but in the private spaces we inhabit, where manipulation hides behind affection, where control masquerades as care, and where the most insidious betrayals are enacted with the softest words, the gentlest smiles, and the calculated precision of someone who knows your weaknesses better than anyone else in the world. And from that realization, a plan began to form in my mind, a plan that relied not on hasty reactions, not on anger or punishment, but on time, observation, and deliberate action. A plan that would allow me to reclaim my autonomy, restore the dignity that had been quietly undermined, and demonstrate to both Emily and myself that the subtle betrayal, no matter how carefully concealed, could be met with patience, intelligence, and the quiet force of a man determined to protect not just his body and health, but his sense of self and the integrity of the father-daughter bond that, despite being tested in the cruelest ways, could still be salvaged, understood, and ultimately restored to a place of respect, care, and mutual understanding, proving that manipulation, though dangerous, is never insurmountable when confronted with clarity, strategy, and the unyielding patience of time as an ally. Night after night, I found myself walking the creaking wooden floors of my house, a quiet, almost imperceptible rhythm that became a kind of meditation, a place where thoughts could settle and clarity could emerge. And I replayed every interaction I had with Emily in my mind with a careful, meticulous eye, analyzing not just her words but the way she said them, the pauses she took, the subtle shifts in tone and expression that betrayed intention beneath the surface of casual concern. Because I had come to understand that what she had mastered was the art of masking manipulation behind affection, the ability to make a calculated insult, a subtle critique, or a guilt-laden comment appear as natural caring, and yet beneath it, it was a strategy, a pattern that if left unchecked, would slowly consume not only my confidence and independence but the entire dynamic of our relationship, transforming the home I had built into a place of silent control and quiet intimidation. I knew, deep down, that confronting her directly, calling out her behavior, or reacting in anger would only backfire, that any direct challenge could ignite defensiveness, resentment, and potentially irreparable damage, because the manipulation was precise, subtle, and emotionally intelligent, and a direct confrontation could easily be reframed as overreaction on my part, leaving me not as the wronged party but as the one perceived to be unstable, oversensitive, or even unfair. And the thought of losing the last shred of the bond one still cherished with her, the moments of genuine connection that occasionally surfaced, made me hesitate and seek another path, one guided not by impulse, anger, or pride, but by patience, observation, and a deliberate, carefully constructed strategy. I began to understand that the greatest power I could wield was not in confrontation but in time itself, in allowing events to unfold, in quietly asserting myself through small, controlled actions that would slowly reclaim the autonomy she had attempted to erode. And in this understanding, I found both solace and purpose, because time, if used correctly, could reveal truth, illuminate intentions, and expose manipulation without me ever having to raise my voice or cast blame prematurely. I started keeping meticulous mental notes at first, cataloging patterns of behavior that revealed when she was most likely to assert control, the precise circumstances under which she tried to make me doubt my judgment, the moments she framed her desires as concern, and the subtle ways she sought to dominate conversations or influence decisions in ways that made me feel inadequate or dependent. Each observation added to a growing picture, a strategic map of her behaviors that allowed me to anticipate, prepare, and subtly counteract them without tipping my hand. And the more I observed, the more I realized the depth of her calculation, the sophistication of her approach, and the undeniable need for a measured, thoughtful response rather than a reactive, emotional one. I began to experiment with small deceptions, tiny acts of controlled vulnerability designed to give her the illusion of power, to allow her minor victories so she would remain confident, even as I quietly solidified my own awareness and prepared the groundwork for a long-term plan. Understanding that the real power lay in subtlety, in the slow reclamation of control, and in the careful timing of each move so that when the moment came to assert boundaries or reveal truths, it would land with clarity, undeniable impact, and minimal risk of defensive backlash. Some nights I would sit in my study, watching her from a distance as she moved through the house, noting the ways she lingered near tasks, how she inserted herself into decisions, and how she used moments of my physical weakness or mental hesitation to assert authority, all while presenting herself as the dutiful, caring daughter, and I marveled, with a mixture of frustration and admiration, at the finesse with which she executed this silent campaign, understanding that this was not casual misbehavior but a conscious strategy, and that my response needed to be equally deliberate, equally intelligent, and executed with the same patience and awareness. I also began to subtly reassert small elements of autonomy without provoking confrontation, taking control of minor decisions, managing finances quietly but efficiently, completing tasks she expected to dominate, and doing so in a manner that appeared unremarkable, almost innocuous, so as not to alert her to the fact that I was observing, analyzing, and countering her moves, and each small success bolstered my confidence, sharpened my focus, and reminded me that time, carefully observed and leveraged, could become the most powerful instrument I had at my disposal. The concept of revenge never entered my mind in its crude form, the kind that seeks immediate retaliation or dramatic confrontation, because I had learned through the slow accumulation of her manipulations that such action would only provide fuel for her to frame me as unreasonable, reactive, or unbalanced. And the wisdom I had accumulated over 50+ years of life told me that true justice is quiet, deliberate, and precise, like a steady river eroding rock over time, invisible in the moment but undeniable in the long view. And so I embraced the strategy of observation, patience, and delayed action, understanding that the longer I could gather insight, the more effective my eventual assertion of boundaries and reclaiming of control would be. And in this, I found both reassurance and a sense of power that had nothing to do with aggression and everything to do with strategy, awareness, and the quiet restoration of my own dignity. I also began to catalog my own emotions with unprecedented care, noting the precise triggers that her manipulations activated, understanding where I felt guilt, doubt, or helplessness, and using these reflections to fortify my resolve, to prevent her from seeing me as fragile, dependent, or weak, even as I allowed her to perceive otherwise, because I understood that control is often psychological, and by maintaining a steady, patient, and calculated demeanor, I could subtly influence her perception while simultaneously strengthening my own capacity to navigate this treacherous emotional landscape. Every day became a balance of observation, preparation, and careful, deliberate action, a dance of presence and restraint, where I allowed myself to appear vulnerable at strategic moments, to concede minor points that she expected to dominate, all while consolidating knowledge, assessing intentions, and quietly planning a path toward long-term equilibrium and the restoration of respect, understanding that each small step, each carefully executed maneuver, was a brick in the foundation of eventual justice, not through retaliation or humiliation, but through clarity, precision, and the power of time as an ally. I began to notice the patterns with increasing sharpness. The way she timed her comments, the subtle pauses that suggested calculation, the use of soft tones to mask sharp intent, and the moments where guilt was deployed as a lever to bend my actions toward her goals. And with each recognition, I felt my confidence grow, my understanding deepen, and my commitment to the long-term strategy solidify, knowing that any hasty action would only reinforce her manipulative position. While measured, patience could allow me to reclaim authority, re-establish boundaries, and ultimately restore balance without fracturing the fragile remnants of love and connection that still existed between us. The realization dawned on me that this was a game of endurance, of strategic observation, and of emotional intelligence, where the strongest response was not confrontation but foresight, not anger but precision, not impulsive reaction but deliberate, calculated engagement. And as I embraced this understanding, I felt a calm settle over me, a quiet confidence that the slow, deliberate use of time as a tool could transform this seemingly insurmountable challenge into an opportunity for restoration, respect, and eventual understanding. A process that would require patience, vigilance, and unyielding clarity, but one that promised the ultimate reward: the reclamation of autonomy, dignity, and the true, unmanipulated love of my daughter, all achieved not through rash action but through the quiet, relentless, and deliberate force of time, observation, and thoughtful strategy, proving that the patience of the mind, the endurance of the spirit, and the careful orchestration of insight and action are far more powerful than any immediate expression of anger or confrontation, and that the greatest victories are often invisible, unfolding slowly and imperceptibly, until the moment comes when they cannot be denied. And I knew, with unwavering certainty, that this approach would allow me not only to protect myself from manipulation but to ultimately guide Emily toward understanding, accountability, and a restoration of respect, ensuring that what had begun as subtle betrayal could, through patience and time, transform into lessons learned, boundaries reestablished, and a relationship rebuilt stronger, wiser, and more resilient than it had ever been before. Once I had fully accepted that patience and careful observation were my greatest allies, I began the slow, deliberate process of regaining control in ways that Emily would neither detect nor suspect, understanding that overt action would only provoke defensiveness, resistance, or further manipulation. So I adopted a strategy of subtle assertion, quietly reclaiming small territories of autonomy and influence within the home that had become a stage for her manipulative behaviors. And I started with finances, a domain that she had gradually insinuated herself into, questioning my decisions, challenging my purchases, and making me feel incompetent, as though the management of my own money had become a test of skill I was destined to fail. But instead of confronting her or hiding my actions, I began managing the accounts with meticulous care, observing every detail, scheduling payments in advance, balancing budgets, and ensuring that nothing slipped through unnoticed, while maintaining an appearance of frailty, pendence, and mild confusion, allowing her to feel confident that she still held authority, that she still dominated the decision-making, while in reality, I was quietly steering the household's financial stability back into my hands. And with each small, unobserved action, I felt a renewed sense of agency, a quiet empowerment that reminded me that control does not always need to be declared. It can be quietly exercised with foresight, precision, and patience. And the subtlety of this approach made it all the more effective, for Emily's confidence in her own power prevented her from scrutinizing my actions too closely, and her habitual need to feel in charge blinded her to the gradual reclamation of authority taking place right under her nose. I also began to reestablish connections with friends and neighbors, people she had subtly attempted to isolate me from through casual dismissals, guilt-laden statements about how much effort it took to maintain relationships, and insinuations that I was too weak or frail to engage socially. And I realized that these relationships, once neglected, were crucial not only for my social well-being but as a source of perspective, validation, and subtle support that would reinforce my confidence and serve as a buffer against her emotional manipulation. So I started attending small gatherings, checking in on old friends, sharing stories, laughing and reminiscing myself in the community I had once been an active part of, allowing her to see glimpses of my resilience without realizing the strategic intent behind each interaction, each smile, each casual conversation about mundane topics that subtly reminded her that I was capable, independent, and observant. Despite the outward appearance of weakness I sometimes allowed to maintain her confidence. At home, I introduced incremental lessons for both of us, reading books on financial independence, casually leaving them open on the kitchen table or coffee table, so that they could be seen but not directly interpreted as instruction, starting gentle conversations about personal boundaries, age, respect, and self-reliance, and even dropping hints through anecdotes from friends or neighbors about people who maintained autonomy and dignity well into their later years, all in a way that seemed organic and conversational rather than didactic. And Emily, confident in her perceived control, noticed the changes but misinterpreted them, believing that I was simply adapting to my limitations, not realizing that every action was part of a deliberate plan to reclaim my independence, assert my authority quietly, and subtly expose the patterns of manipulation she had established. Simultaneously, I began to document everything with painstaking attention to detail. Not in a way that was accusatory, nor as ammunition for confrontation, but as a record for clarity and reflection, cataloging moments of overreach, manipulations disguised as concern, guilt-laden statements, dismissive remarks, and occasions when she mocked, belittled, or tried to dominate decisions that had always been mine to make. And each entry in my mental ledger sharpened my understanding of her strategies, timing, and tendencies, allowing me to anticipate her moves, navigate potential conflicts, and strengthen my own resolve, all while containing the outward appearance of frailty, gratitude, and compliance. A performance designed not to deceive for deceit's sake, but to allow me the space and time to execute my plan with precision, patience, and strategic foresight, ensuring that when the moment came to reveal the truth or assert boundaries, it would be unmistakable, undeniable, and transformative. I became acutely aware that this process was less about humiliation or punishment and more about the careful exposure of truth, for both our sakes, allowing Emily to recognize, reflect upon, and learn from the consequences of her manipulations, while also restoring my own autonomy, confidence, and dignity without escalating tension or risking unnecessary rupture in the fragile father-daughter bond that remained. And each day I observed, adjusted, and refined my approach, noting the times she attempted to assert dominance, the subtle changes in tone when I began reclaiming control, the fleeting glances that revealed awareness but not yet comprehension, and the gradual weakening of her hold on the psychological leverage she had wielded for months, all while appearing grateful, compliant, or frail enough to maintain her sense of superiority, her illusion of power, and her belief that she remained in control, a belief that ironically ensured the success of my strategy. Every interaction became a test of patience, foresight, and subtle influence, whether it was a casual exchange about the grocery list, a discussion about paying bills, or a conversation about household chores. And in each, I practiced restraint, observation, and precision, interspersing moments of mild compliance with actions that quietly reasserted my competence, skill, and judgment, reinforcing a pattern where Emily's manipulations began to lose effectiveness as I regained control, incrementally, without confrontation or overt challenge. And as weeks turned into months, the pattern became increasingly apparent to me. A quiet victory unfolding with invisible, deliberate steps, a reclamation of space, authority, and respect that had been eroded by her subtle betrayals, and the awareness of this slow but undeniable shift imbued me with a quiet satisfaction, a sense of empowerment, and the reassurance that time, when wielded thoughtfully and deliberately, could serve as a powerful instrument for restoring balance and justice in a relationship that had been tested in ways I had never anticipated. And in these small victories, repeated day after day, I recognized the deeper lesson. That true power is often quiet, subtle, and patient, not loud, confrontational, or immediate, and that the careful orchestration of observation, calculated action, and strategic patience can achieve what rashness or anger never could, allowing me not only to reclaim authority within my own home, but to guide Emily toward an awareness of her own behaviors, fostering reflection, accountability, and eventually a more authentic and respectful connection, proving that even in situations where manipulation, betrayal, and subtle psychological control threaten to overwhelm, a deliberate, patient, and measured approach can quietly and effectively restore equilibrium, dignity, and trust, and that through careful observation, strategic subtlety, and the quiet application of time as an ally, it is possible to reclaim one's life, autonomy, and relationships, transforming what had been a landscape of control and coercion into one of clarity, understanding, and mutual respect, where both parties can learn, grow, and rebuild the bonds of love and family in a stronger, wiser, and more resilient way than ever before. Months had quietly slipped by since I first recognized the subtle but relentless manipulation Emily had woven into our daily lives. Months filled with patient observation, meticulous note-taking, strategic assertion of small victories, and the careful re-establishment of boundaries that had slowly but surely begun to restore my sense of agency and dignity. And yet, despite this progress, a lingering tension hung in the air, an almost imperceptible weight of unspoken truths and withheld recognition that neither of us could fully articulate but that pervaded every interaction, every glance, every measured exchange of words in our home. And I knew that the moment of reckoning could not be forced, could not be rushed, because any attempt at confrontation too early would ignite defensiveness, recrimination, and possibly irreparable damage to the fragile connection we still shared. And so I continued to weave my plan with the patient precision of someone who has learned that time, when leveraged correctly, can accomplish more than anger, force, or harsh words ever could. And I spent countless evenings reflecting, pacing the familiar floors of my living room, drinking coffee as the soft glow of the lamp cast long shadows over the walls lined with decades of memories. Each picture, each memento, a silent witness to the bond that had once been unbreakable, a bond that I now understood required careful repair rather than simple assertion of authority. Because love, trust, and respect cannot be demanded. They must be restored gradually, thoughtfully, and deliberately. And as I contemplated the path forward, I realized that the confrontation I needed would not be dramatic, would not involve shouting or accusations, but would instead emerge from subtle storytelling, reflection, and the gentle exposure of truths that had been obscured by manipulation. And I began planning for the precise moment when Emily would finally perceive her actions through my eyes, without me needing to force the realization or risk fracturing the tenuous threads of our relationship. One quiet evening, the air calm, the house bathed in the soft glow of twilight, I invited her to join me for a simple coffee in the kitchen, a setting deliberately chosen for its intimacy, familiarity, and lack of external pressure, a place where conversation could flow naturally, and where the small, routine act of sharing a cup together could become the stage for reflection, understanding, and the gentle unfolding of truth. And when she appeared, her smile practiced, confident and unassuming, I sensed the layers of expectation she had carried for months, the subtle aura of control she believed she maintained over me, and I recognized the perfect opportunity to let the carefully nurtured strategy of patience and observation finally take effect. As the steam rose from our mugs, I began speaking softly, almost casually at first, about my health, the isolation I sometimes felt despite the home filled with memories, and the little challenges that had made ordinary days unexpectedly heavy. But I wove these admissions carefully, never sounding accusatory, never framing her actions as intentional harm, only expressing the reality of my experiences in ways that would illuminate the underlying patterns she had created. And gradually, I began to layer in the observations I had collected over months, narrating incidents where her concern had crossed into subtle manipulation, moments when words meant to soothe had instead coerced, actions intended to help had instead controlled. And all of this was conveyed without judgment, without blame, only as a reflection of lived experience, leaving space for self-realization to emerge organically. I noticed, with growing satisfaction and a sense of quiet vindication, that her confident, practiced smile began to falter, the ease she carried so effortlessly over weeks and months showing subtle cracks as she processed the narrative I laid before her, the pattern emerging naturally in her mind as she listened to the story of our shared life filtered through my perception, a story that revealed consequences she had not accounted for, the emotional weight of actions she had disguised as care, and the reality that her attempts to dominate, influence, and manipulate had not gone unnoticed, had not escaped reflection, and had left a mark on the very foundation of trust and respect that once defined our relationship. The air in the kitchen grew thick with tension, the silence between sips of coffee pregnant with unspoken understanding, and I observed the gradual shift in her posture, the slight hesitation in her gestures, the way her eyes darted to mine searching for explanation, validation, and perhaps forgiveness. And it became clear that the careful orchestration of patience, strategic observation, and subtle assertion of autonomy had created a space in which revelation could occur naturally, without coercion or confrontation, a space where Emily could, for the first time in months, truly see herself through the lens of the person she had sought to control. And the weight of that realization was tangible, almost physical, settling over both of us in a quiet, shared acknowledgement of truth that needed no words to confirm its presence. In that moment, I could sense her internal struggle, the conflict between pride, surprise, and the dawning recognition that her perception of control had been incomplete, that the independence and dignity I had quietly maintained had never been fully eroded, and that my patience, consistency, and careful execution of strategy had allowed me to reclaim authority without confrontation, to expose the truth without anger, and to restore the balance that manipulation had threatened to destroy. And, as she froze, silent, searching for a response that did not come, I realized the profound power of restraint, the incredible efficacy of allowing time, observation, and subtle influence to do the work that impulsive confrontation never could. And I felt a mixture of relief, quiet triumph, and deep, almost overwhelming satisfaction, knowing that the scales of our relationship were beginning to tip back toward equilibrium. There was no shouting, no recrimination, no pointed accusation. Instead, the revelation emerged gently, naturally, almost effortlessly, as if the weight of truth had been patiently waiting for the right moment to unfold. And in that stillness, I could see the genuine shock in Emily's eyes, the hesitation in her expressions, the almost imperceptible tremor of recognition that her actions had consequences, that her attempts to manipulate had been observed, noted, and countered with patience, intelligence, and subtlety. And for the first time in months, I felt the scales of our relationship shift toward a more balanced state, toward understanding, accountability, and the possibility of renewed connection. I realized that what I had feared as an impossible confrontation had in fact been unnecessary. The careful groundwork of months, the deliberate cultivation of awareness, autonomy, and strategic patience had created the conditions for self-realization, and the quiet power of time, observation, and deliberate action had achieved what anger or immediate retaliation could never have accomplished, allowing Emily to see herself, her behavior, and the impact of her choices from a perspective she could not have perceived amidst the daily emotional turbulence of manipulation. And as we sat together, the coffee long forgotten, I understood the depth of this accomplishment, the profound subtlety of a confrontation that needed no force, no aggression, no shouting to succeed, and the remarkable capacity of patience, strategy, and human insight to transform even the most delicate, manipulated, and strained relationships into moments of clarity, connection, and genuine reflection, proving that sometimes the confrontation that matters most is the one you allow to unfold naturally, the one that emerges from the careful orchestration of time, observation, and quiet, deliberate action. And in that kitchen, in that silent, pregnant moment of recognition, I knew that months of planning, patience, and subtle maneuvering had not only protected my autonomy and dignity, but had also created the conditions for Emily to recognize her own actions, to feel the weight of the subtle betrayals she had enacted, and to glimpse the possibility of a relationship restored to balance, respect, and authentic understanding. A revelation that was more powerful, more enduring, and more transformative than any confrontation I could have forced. And I felt an overwhelming mixture of relief, vindication, and hope, knowing that the delicate equilibrium had finally begun to return, that time had indeed been my greatest ally, and that, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I could see the path forward not as a battle, but as an opportunity for restoration, understanding, and the rekindling of trust and connection that had always been the true foundation of our father-daughter bond, waiting patiently to be rebuilt with care, insight, and unwavering dedication. The weeks that followed that quiet, pivotal moment in the kitchen unfolded like the slow turning of pages in a long-forgotten diary, each day carrying a mixture of tentative hope, fragile understanding, and the lingering echoes of months, even years, of unspoken tension and subtle betrayal. And though the transformation was far from perfect, each interaction, each shared moment, revealed the profound and delicate work required to rebuild a family that had been fractured by manipulation, misunderstanding, and unrecognized ambition. And I began to notice small but significant shifts in Emily, the daughter who had once wielded guilt and strategic concern as tools to control, influence, and dominate, who had gradually, almost imperceptibly, begun to step back, to pause, to reflect on the way her words and actions affected not only me but the fabric of the family we had long shared. And it was in those pauses, those fleeting moments of self-awareness, that the first signs of genuine change appeared, as though the revelation of her behavior, illuminated through patient storytelling, careful observation, and the quiet exercise of time as an ally, had allowed her to see herself with clarity. And in that clarity, humility and understanding quietly began to take root, shifting her approach, her tone, and her engagement in ways that would gradually restore not just respect but trust and affection, the very foundations that had once defined our relationship but had eroded under the weight of manipulation and unspoken expectations. The early days were delicate, filled with cautious experimentation as we both navigated this new dynamic, and I began to orchestrate small, intentional opportunities to rebuild connection, starting with shared meals at the table, simple, unpressured moments where conversation could flow naturally, where silence was not uncomfortable but contemplative, and where the act of breaking bread together became a subtle ritual of restoration. Each exchange an opportunity to remind both of us of the affection and bond that had always existed, even beneath layers of resentment, misunderstanding, and the manipulations that had grown like shadows over the years. And in those meals, I began to notice the first genuine sparks of laughter, the small, authentic moments of joy that had been absent for too long, as if a gentle light was breaking through the cracks, warming the corners of our lives that had grown cold under the weight of distrust and strategic behavior. I could feel the tension of past grievances slowly dissipating, replaced with an emerging rhythm of honest dialogue, a cadence where words were no longer wielded as weapons but as instruments of understanding, where stories of the past were acknowledged not with accusation or defensiveness, but with recognition and reflection. And as we spoke, I found myself sharing experiences, feelings, and fears that had long been bottled beneath layers of pride, patience, and careful observation, revealing to Emily the depth of my emotional experience without blaming, condemning, or diminishing her. And I could see, in her eyes, that the realization of her past behavior was settling, taking root, and that a sense of empathy, accountability, and genuine remorse was beginning to reshape the way she interacted, the way she listened, and the way she chose her words and actions. Slowly, the house transformed from a stage of quiet manipulation into a space of tentative collaboration, the air less charged with tension and more filled with possibility. And in those moments, I understood that restoration is rarely immediate or absolute, but instead emerges as the careful accumulation of small, deliberate steps that reaffirm connection, respect, and trust. And each day, I reinforced the importance of boundaries, subtly asserting the respect due to both of us without overt confrontation, creating a framework in which Emily could express herself freely, but also understand that control, manipulation, and coercion were no longer part of the dynamic. And in doing so, I reclaimed not only my dignity but my authority as a father and as a man who had been tested, challenged, and almost subdued by circumstances, only to emerge wiser, more patient, and quietly empowered. There were moments of struggle, of tension, where old habits threatened to resurface, where her initial confidence and occasional impatience reminded me of the delicate balance we were still cultivating. But instead of reacting with anger or force, I applied the same principle that had guided me throughout this journey: patience, observation, and the subtle exercise of insight, allowing the moment to reveal itself, letting her notice, reflect, and self-correct without coercion. And in those moments, I felt the profound power of strategic restraint, the ability to guide without dictating, to shape without controlling, and to restore without punishing, a nuanced approach that demanded not only emotional intelligence but also the humility to accept incremental progress and the courage to resist immediate gratification in favor of enduring, meaningful change. Over time, Emily began to engage in honest, heartfelt conversations, the kind we had rarely shared in years, where she expressed concerns, curiosities, and even apologies, acknowledging patterns of behavior that had caused distance and tension. And I responded not with judgment but with openness, reflection, and the gentle guidance that comes from understanding that restoration is a collaborative process, requiring the willingness to listen, accept, and adapt from both sides. And in these exchanges, I observed her growing awareness, her evolving respect, and her gradual willingness to step outside the patterns that had previously defined her approach, replacing manipulation with dialogue, coercion with curiosity, and guilt with genuine consideration for another's experience. Beyond conversations, the subtle rituals of daily life became opportunities to rebuild trust and connection. From shared meals to casual walks, from household chores done in collaboration to moments of quiet presence that reinforced the unspoken understanding that each of us had a place of respect, agency, and dignity within the family unit. And in these acts, I could feel the transformation not only in Emily but in myself, as the slow accumulation of deliberate, thoughtful actions began to restore balance, reaffirm autonomy, and cultivate a climate in which both of us could flourish without fear, resentment, or hidden agendas. And I realized that this restoration was deeper than surface compliance. It was the reestablishment of mutual understanding, the cultivation of empathy, and the gentle teaching of accountability through lived example, observation, and patient engagement, a process that would continue over time, deepening with each honest conversation, each shared experience, and each reaffirmation of boundaries and respect. The joy, though subtle at first, began to permeate our interactions, laughter returning like a distant memory now being rediscovered, the warmth of familial connections slowly knitting the fragments of our relationship back together. A delicate tapestry woven not with coercion or fear but with patience, understanding, and the intentional restoration of trust. And I found that in guiding her without crushing her spirit, in exercising authority with care, and in reclaiming autonomy through deliberate, thoughtful steps, I had achieved something far more profound than mere control or revenge. I had restored the dignity of both of us, reaffirmed the integrity of the father-daughter bond, and demonstrated that even relationships stretched to their breaking points could be rebuilt when approached with clarity, patience, and intentionality. And as Emily grew more thoughtful, more reflective, and more genuinely attentive to the needs, feelings, and perspectives of others, I felt a deep, almost indescribable sense of fulfillment, knowing that the restoration we were experiencing was not the product of coercion, confrontation, or retribution, but the deliberate, quiet, patient work of a man who understood the power of time, observation, and strategic action, and who had learned that the greatest transformations often unfold not in dramatic gestures but in the accumulation of small, consistent, thoughtful choices, each one reinforcing connection, trust, and mutual respect. And in this careful, deliberate rebuilding, I saw the emergence of a family that, though once fractured, could now grow stronger, more resilient, and more genuinely connected than ever before. A family in which the lessons of patience, empathy, and strategic restoration had taken root, ensuring that the bond between a father and daughter could be repaired, strengthened, and nurtured in ways that honored the past, respected the present, and created a foundation for a future defined not by manipulation or guilt but by love, understanding, and shared dignity, proving that the true power of patience, insight, and thoughtful action can restore what seemed lost, mend what was broken, and transform the fragments of a once tense relationship into a whole, vibrant, and enduring connection that neither time, betrayal, nor circumstance can easily diminish. Looking back on the months, and even years, that had led to this point of clarity and quiet restoration, I now understand with a depth that only experience can bring that betrayal rarely announces itself with the crashing drama that one imagines in novels or on screens. It rarely arrives in the form of grand gestures, shouting matches, or dramatic confrontations, but instead seeps quietly into the corners of everyday life, into the subtle manipulations, the soft-spoken guilt, the calculated expressions of concern that conceal deeper motives, the way a word can be twisted, a suggestion framed as advice, a simple act of care transformed into a lever for control. And it is this quiet, patient, almost imperceptible form of betrayal that often cuts the deepest, leaving wounds that are not visible, but felt, carried silently in the chest, the stomach, the joints, and in the mind, as one begins to second-guess their own perceptions, judgments, and actions. And at first, I found myself lost within this fog of uncertainty, questioning not just Emily's intentions but my own ability to discern, to protect, and to maintain the dignity and autonomy that had defined me for over half a century, because the betrayal had been so subtle, so perfectly disguised as concern, that it required me to slow down, to observe, to catalog every nuance of behavior, to analyze tone, gesture, and timing in ways I had never done before. And in doing so, I realized that the greatest acts of resilience, are rarely those that meet force with force, but rather those that observe, calculate, and deploy patience as a strategic instrument, allowing time to work as both teacher and ally, revealing truths, exposing patterns, and granting the clarity necessary to respond with precision rather than impulsive emotion. And I began to see the power inherent in this quiet approach, the kind of power that does not scream, does not demand attention, but builds slowly, imperceptibly, until it is undeniable, evident in outcomes rather than gestures, in the reclamation of dignity rather than in confrontation, in the quiet restoration of balance rather than in the destruction of another. As I reflected on the journey with Emily, I saw how every subtle act of observation, every patient decision to allow her the illusion of control while quietly asserting my own authority, every deliberate step to rebuild my social connections, my financial independence, and my personal agency had coalesced into a slow, inexorable reclamation of both autonomy and respect, a process that required resilience, humility, and an unyielding commitment to the long game, because the stakes were not simply about being right or punishing wrongdoing, but about maintaining the integrity of the relationship, preserving the dignity of both parties, and ensuring that the love that had once been foundational, though tested, could be rebuilt stronger and wiser than it had ever been before. And it was in this understanding that I found a profound lesson. Strength is not always measured by physical capacity or outward displays of dominance, but by the ability to maintain composure, clarity, and self-respect in the face of manipulation, to endure without yielding to impulsive retaliation, and to act deliberately, guided by insight, observation, and patience, allowing circumstances and ultimately time itself to guide the path toward resolution and restoration. I began to realize that the subtle betrayals, the emotional manipulations, and the quiet strategies employed by those we trust the most are often more challenging than any external conflict, because they strike at the foundation of who we are, our sense of self, and our capacity to trust and love unreservedly. And yet, paradoxically, they also provide the greatest opportunities for growth, insight, and strategic mastery, because navigating such treacherous terrain requires reflection, empathy, and the cultivation of a patience that, when deployed thoughtfully, can transform vulnerability into strength, observation into strategy, and manipulation into a mirror that reflects both the betrayer and the betrayed, illuminating the paths toward understanding, accountability, and eventual reconciliation. Through this journey, I also discovered that time is not merely a neutral backdrop against which events unfold, but an active participant, a silent ally that allows for the slow accumulation of clarity, insight, and strategic advantage, granting the space to observe patterns, understand motives, and craft responses that are measured, deliberate, and ultimately effective. And in embracing time as a tool rather than a constraint, I experienced a liberation of sorts, a realization that patience can accomplish what force, anger, or impulsive reaction never can, because it allows for the full weight of observation, reflection, and preparation to be brought to bear in the moment when revelation, confrontation, or restoration is both inevitable and meaningful. I reflected deeply on the transformation not only in Emily but in myself, recognizing that the journey from subtle betrayal to restored balance had required me to cultivate emotional resilience, mental clarity, and a quiet confidence that did not need validation. Because true power lies in understanding one's own boundaries, maintaining dignity under pressure, and navigating conflict with intelligence and foresight rather than impulsive emotion. And as I considered the path forward, I recognized that the lessons extended far beyond my relationship with Emily, touching every aspect of life where trust, influence, and vulnerability intersect, revealing that the careful management of time, the deliberate observation of behavior, and the patient orchestration of actions are universal tools that can restore equilibrium, preserve dignity, and cultivate understanding in any context where subtle betrayal or manipulation threatens to destabilize the natural order of respect and connection. I understood, perhaps more profoundly than ever, that even when those we love most turn against us, even when betrayal comes not with the blunt force of violence but with the quiet precision of strategic manipulation, there remains a path to navigate the treacherous waters without losing oneself, without resorting to vengeance that consumes as much as it destroys, and without burning bridges that may yet be rebuilt. And in this recognition, I found a sense of peace, a steady confidence that comes from knowing that the careful deployment of patience, clarity, and insight can achieve what force never could, that the slow, deliberate reclamation of autonomy, dignity, and trust is ultimately more transformative than immediate confrontation, and that the bonds of love and family, though stretched to their limits, can endure, heal, and evolve when approached with deliberate care, strategic intelligence, and unwavering commitment to understanding, empathy, and mutual respect. Looking back now, I see the months of tension, observation, subtle maneuvering, and patient planning not as a period of conflict alone, but as an education in human behavior, relationships, and the enduring power of time as a tool of restoration, a teacher of patience, and a silent accomplice in the pursuit of justice that does not humiliate, punish, or destroy, but rather illuminates, restores, and strengthens, revealing that the most profound victories are often quiet, invisible to the casual observer, yet transformative in their consequences, altering not only the course of a relationship but the trajectory of personal growth, emotional resilience, and the capacity for wisdom, empathy, and genuine connection. And in embracing these lessons, I came to understand that true strength is measured not by the immediate exercise of power, but by the ability to maintain clarity, patience, and integrity under pressure, to navigate betrayal without succumbing to its corrosive effects, and to allow time to become the instrument through which understanding, reconciliation, and restoration emerge naturally, almost effortlessly, in a process that is both humbling and profoundly empowering, ultimately revealing that even when the people we love most falter, misstep, or turn against us, there remains a path forward defined not by vengeance, anger, or coercion, but by insight, patience, dignity, and the quiet but undeniable force of time as an ally in the enduring pursuit of justice, understanding, and authentic restoration. A path that I now see clearly and walk with confidence, hope, and a profound sense of peace. Today, as I sit in the same living room where so much tension, manipulation, and subtle betrayal had once played out, I can feel a quiet, almost sacred sense of renewal in the air. A feeling that the months of patient observation, careful strategy, and deliberate, measured responses have culminated not merely in a reclamation of autonomy, dignity, and control, but in something far more profound, a restoration of connection, understanding, and empathy between Emily and myself, a father and daughter who had once drifted dangerously close to a fracture that might have permanently broken us apart. And as I reflect on this journey, I realize that the lessons embedded in our shared experiences are as much for me as they are for her. That every moment of betrayal, every manipulative word or action, every carefully veiled expression of guilt or control, was not just a challenge to my patience or authority, but also a mirror reflecting opportunities for growth, introspection, and the development of emotional intelligence that I had not fully cultivated before. And in embracing this perspective, I have come to understand that betrayal, when handled with care, observation, and strategic patience, is not merely an obstacle to overcome but a profound teacher, revealing the strengths, vulnerabilities, and complexities inherent in human relationships, and teaching that the greatest victories in life are rarely those that are immediate, forceful, or loud, but are instead those that are quiet, patient, and deliberate, allowing insight, wisdom, and clarity to guide action in ways that honor dignity, respect, and the intricate bonds that define family, trust, and love. I see now that the transformation that occurred between Emily and me was not accidental, nor was it the result of confrontation, anger, or punishment. It was the product of carefully orchestrated patience, the disciplined exercise of observation, and the deliberate cultivation of space and time in which truth could reveal itself naturally. And in this realization, I understand that justice, often imagined as loud or vengeful, is far more powerful when it whispers, when it unfolds gradually, imperceptibly, allowing the betrayer to recognize their actions, the consequences of those actions, and the opportunity to adjust, grow, and engage with empathy. And for Emily, that slow, quiet process became a mirror, reflecting the consequences of manipulation, the weight of guilt imposed upon another, and the delicate, fragile nature of trust when it is tested repeatedly. And in witnessing the restoration of my own dignity and authority, she could see, perhaps for the first time, the human cost of her actions, the real impact of her words, and the responsibility inherent in familial love and connection, which, when mishandled, can inflict deep, lasting harm even without dramatic gestures or violence. I am healthier now, not only physically but emotionally. And I feel a resilience and awareness that comes not from force or domination but from the deliberate mastery of patience, observation, and strategic thinking, a clarity that allows me to recognize manipulation without being ensnared by it, to set boundaries without creating unnecessary conflict, and to act decisively without sacrificing empathy. And Emily, through this process, has begun to internalize the lessons embedded in these months of careful observation and subtle recalibration, understanding that empathy is not merely a performative gesture, that trust is delicate and must be nurtured, and that respect for another's autonomy is not negotiable but foundational to any relationship. And I can see the growth in her demeanor, in the thoughtful pauses she takes before speaking, in the careful consideration evident in her decisions, and in the genuine moments of connection and laughter that have begun to fill our home. Once again, demonstrating that restoration is possible even after betrayal, but only when approached with insight, patience, and intentionality, and not through coercion, intimidation, or reactive anger. This experience has also imparted to me a profound understanding of the mechanics of human relationships, of the way subtle manipulation, emotional leverage, and guilt can erode trust over time, often without the victim fully realizing the depth of control until the pattern has been established. And it has taught me that the response to such situations does not need to be immediate, confrontational, or destructive. Instead, it can be a slow, deliberate process of reclaiming authority, dignity, and balance while maintaining compassion and connection. And in doing so, one not only restores personal integrity but also provides the betrayer with the opportunity to witness the impact of their actions and to learn, adapt, and grow from that recognition, which, in the long term, leads to more authentic, respectful, and meaningful relationships. Looking back, I see the months of quiet struggle, the nights spent reflecting, pacing, and analyzing every interaction not as wasted time but as essential groundwork, a preparation that allowed the eventual restoration to unfold naturally, almost effortlessly, without the need for dramatic confrontations, ultimatums, or punitive measures. And I realized that the most effective forms of justice are often the least visible, quietly operating behind the scenes, guided by wisdom, experience, and strategic patience, creating conditions in which insight, understanding, and reconciliation become inevitable. And I now understand that this approach not only preserves relationships but strengthens them, proving that the careful, patient navigation of betrayal can transform what feels like an ending into a beginning, a chance to redefine roles, set boundaries, and cultivate a new, healthier dynamic that honors both individuals' autonomy, dignity, and capacity for growth. I can see now that betrayal, though painful, is also a teacher, revealing where boundaries were blurred, where empathy was lacking, and where vigilance is necessary to protect oneself emotionally. And I have learned that responding with immediate anger, retaliation, or punitive action rarely yields lasting resolution, but responding with patience, observation, and the deliberate use of time as an ally allows for a deeper understanding, greater clarity, and the restoration of balance that endures, not only benefiting the one who was wronged but also offering the betrayer a chance to witness, internalize, and ultimately correct their behavior, fostering growth, accountability, and the potential for a more authentic, enacted relationship moving forward. Today, Emily and I are rebuilding not just the routines of our shared life, but also the very essence of our relationship, filling spaces once heavy with tension and suspicion with moments of genuine connection, shared laughter, and honest conversation. And in these moments, I see clearly the fruits of patient strategy, the power of observation, and the subtle influence of time as a restorative force, creating a family dynamic that is stronger, wiser, and more resilient than it was before the period of subtle betrayal. And I understand that these lessons extend far beyond the confines of our home, offering insight into the nature of human behavior, the delicate dynamics of trust, and the remarkable efficacy of patience and strategic restraint in navigating conflict and restoring harmony. I have learned that strength is measured not only in physical ability or outward dominance but in the capacity to endure, observe, and act with wisdom, that dignity is reclaimed through quiet assertion rather than confrontation, and that authentic justice often whispers rather than roars, reshaping circumstances with precision, subtlety, and enduring impact. And in embracing this philosophy, I have achieved not only personal growth and restoration but also guided Emily toward a deeper understanding of empathy, accountability, and the profound consequences of one's actions, allowing both of us to step into a new chapter of life defined by mutual respect, understanding, and the deliberate cultivation of a bond resilient enough to withstand future challenges without sacrificing autonomy, dignity, or emotional well-being. And so, if there is one lesson I hope others take from this experience, it is that betrayal, no matter how subtle or insidious, does not have to end in destruction. It can be transformed into an opportunity for reflection, growth, and meaningful restoration. That patience, careful observation, and the deliberate use of time are among the most powerful tools in navigating the complexities of human relationships, and that justice, wisdom, and restoration need not be loud or destructive to be effective, because when applied thoughtfully and consistently, these qualities can change everything, restoring balance, fostering understanding, and allowing both the betrayed and the betrayer to emerge stronger, wiser, and more capable of sustaining authentic, compassionate, and resilient relationships moving forward, proving that even the deepest wounds of subtle betrayal can become the foundation for profound transformation, enduring connection, and the quiet but undeniable power of patience, insight, and human resilience in shaping the course of our lives and the lives of those we love most.